and a warm welcome to the Presidential Charlotte Mannya-Maxeke and President SRC of the Student Representative Council Dialogue. This is part of a monthly dialogue series which we are conducting with the Charlotte Maxeke Foundation in the year of Charlotte Maxeke. Each month we have a conversation and a dialogue between different presidents, and we're really pleased today to focus on the theme of the human right to education with an illustrious group of presidents. They are leading the new generations in student representative councils. They are leaders of our societies, not just as we often refer to young people, leaders of the future, but indeed they are leaders of today. The topics of the discussion, because Mam Charlotte Maxeke has always been very interested in matters of education, is around the theme of the human right to education. And amongst the issues that is very much in the mind of South African, access to free education, the proposed criteria for one to have access to free education, as well as the implementation about how do we as a nation move forward in terms of this broad objective that have been set in 1955 when we said that the doors of learning and culture should be open to all. We should also mention that we are having a conversation that the focus on free education for today focus on the post-school education and training sector. And that sector includes universities. It includes your skill sector, so therefore the issue of lifelong learning. It includes education for unemployed youth. It includes the TVET colleges. And it's a broad sense of a sector that must contribute towards, on the one hand, making sure, as Mam Maxeke has said throughout our life, that we have the necessary skills to build our society, to build our economy, to build our social lives, our community, but also ensuring that we contribute as active citizens, as productive citizens in the life of our country. And before I hand over to start the program, I just want to read a quote from Mam Charlotte Maxeke when she said, and I quote, "I wish there were more of our people here to enjoy the privileges of Wilberforce and then go back to teach our people so that our home can lose that awful name, the Dark Continent, and be properly called the Continent of Light." End of quote. And of course, this was her studies overseas, in which she became the first Black student to receive a BSc degree and come back to South Africa. And the hope that education is not just for her, but education for all. We're going to start our program with opening and welcome message from the Deputy Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation, Mr. Buti Manamela, who has a very important and very illustrious CV. He's the Deputy Minister of Higher Education, Science and Innovation. Previous portfolios include as Deputy Minister of Higher Education and Training, Deputy Minister in the Presidency for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, as well as Youth Development and Administration. He's been a Member of Parliament since 2009, serving as Whip for the Labour portfolio, as well as Chief Volunteer to Parliament for Nelson Mandela Day. He's a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party, has served as National Secretary of its Young Communist Youth League from 2003 until 2014, and has also served in various roles in the ANC Youth League, the South African Student Congress, and various student organizations. He's also been working in the trade union organization. He's completed his matric at Pachameng High School, went to study at Mamelodi College, a certificate in electronics, completed his postgraduate diploma and Masters of Management at University of Witwatersrand, and is currently studying for a second Master's in Economic Policy with the University of London. Deputy Minister, with that introduction, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your welcoming remarks on the critical theme. Over to you. Are we still trying to get him on? Okay. Okay, we have a little bit of a struggle to get the minister to log in, but our next speaker is just as illustrious CV in this presidential dialogue. It's Ms. Nicole Morris, who's the Acting Dean for Student Affairs, University of the Free State. She's a young and dynamic woman with a primary focus on leadership development, training, innovation in Africa, as well as academic excellence. She enrolled at Wits University, where she did a Bachelor of Education, a postgraduate degree in management, Masters of Business Administration, with a research thesis on factors influencing the mass market perception of e-commerce in South Africa. During her tenure, she served as the South African chapter advisor for the Golden Key International Honorary Society, which is a global academic society which honors the top 15% achievers within the university space, which she currently holds. She was also elected as an NEC member of the National Association of Student Development Advisors and Practitioners, and is currently the Secretary General of this association. In that role, she increased the visibility of female student practitioners and their role in student development, and she has managed to initiate research conversation on a scholarship on student affairs, which is quite an important development. With a vested interest in leadership development and training, Nicole firmly believes in the power of building future leaders and entrepreneurs. Her approach is to remove any limitations to individual potential and personal achievement. Ms. Nicole Morris, welcome to this platform, and we look forward to your contribution. The floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. So, Honourable Deputy Minister, Buti Manamela, I trust that you have joined us, sir. Chairperson of the Charlotte Mannya-Maxeke Institute, Dr. Yonela Njisane, Dr. Sarumbe, leadership of the various student representative councils, of course, my alma mater, Pendulo, and our esteemed Program Director, Phoebe Potgieter-Ngubule, all protocol observed. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an absolute honor to be part of this esteemed occasion, alongside women who represent the spirit of President Charlotte Mannya-Maxeke in their respective fields of expertise, to be among contemporary luminaries in South Africa and global spaces who stand on the shoulders of giants, whom in a way we're commemorating, I think, not only today, this month, but as the program director indicated, on a monthly basis. Now, colleagues, Charlotte Maxeke was an unconventional woman who made a contribution at a time when it was exceptionally hard for women to rise to the fore in the liberation of politics. As many have mentioned, and the program director, of course, alluded to earlier, she is known as the first Black woman from South Africa to hold a graduate degree. Maxeke was a stalwart for the fight for equal opportunities and progress in particularly women's rights. Charlotte Maxeke was a scholar, like all the panelists here this afternoon. However, she remained rooted in her indigeneity and culture with an emancipatory outlook. Now, the process of emancipation requires that women excellence be nurtured and valued. So, for example, this afternoon on our panel, colleagues, we've got Dr. Sarumbe, who is the youngest PhD graduate in Africa. As we know, at the heart of Charlotte Maxeke's activism was a deep quest for education and the need to use education to support change in humanity, which is why we're also delighted to have our activist scholar, Phoebe Potgieter, as one of our speakers. And of course, we're humbled to have her as our program director here this afternoon too. Maxeke's reach through the Bantu's Women's League enabled the removal of the glass ceiling that restricted women elevation in mainstream politics. What we can take from Maxeke is her resilient fight for equal opportunities and progress for the liberation of women in South African society as a basic human right. In a higher education perspective, Maxeke fought for equal opportunities and progress for all students as encompassed as a human right to education. As a student affairs professional, I cannot leave the space without outlining the role that student affairs plays toward the right to education. Martin Mandu, who happens to be a scholar of student affairs and in his scholarly articles, he's raised important questions in terms of who is the student, socially, economically, politically, culturally, educationally, etc., and how prepared is the institution for who the student is in a way that is currently defining, structuring, configuring, and offering its academic programs. Now, it's important to note that for this context, he relates to student development and success. With that being said, student affairs has over the past decade developed, reshaped, reformed, and reimagined its programs and services in order to constantly respond to the who question raised by Martin. The student affairs now consists of various services which respond to the support aspect, namely student counseling, development, disability, orientation, career services, social work, cooperative student governance, to name but a few. And so to the young leaders on this panel this afternoon, the road has been paved and many of these giants inspire you, but of course it's not over. Lastly, just like any revolution, the emancipation of women needs allies for it to find expression in all spheres of life. And so therefore I would like to thank Honorable President Mpendulo and the others on the panel and acknowledge and appreciate you for the role that these extraordinary leaders play in shaping our society today. So Program Director, I thank you once again, and I wish Pendulo there at Wits University all the best, and our other student leaders in taking us forward and shaping and raising important questions. And I think what needs to be done to achieve equal opportunities and progress for all students and learners in society will require a renewed way of thinking to mitigate them. And I trust that our student leaders will pose those difficult questions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicole Morris. I think that your input has set a good foundation for our dialogue today. Let me start sort of by the middle of your speech, that the question about who is the student. Student affairs and student services play an important role in the life of a student throughout the time that they spend on campus, and therefore it is important to understand that our students come from a broad, diverse backgrounds and the kind of support that they therefore need. And the important issue about the evolution of student affairs. And then your reference to Mannya-Maxeke as an unconventional woman. And it is important, but I think that part of the struggle for an end to patriarchy, for a truly non-sexist South Africa and a truly non-sexist Africa, is that the women leaders like Mannya-Maxeke, but also the women that we have on this platform today, that they shouldn't be unconventional. It should be the norm, that it's normal for women to occupy these leadership positions, that they don't have to be unconventional in order to be able to occupy these positions. And as Mum Charlotte's generation has said, that we need to ensure that we fight side by side with our menfolk, not just for our liberation, but also for the emancipation of women. We do say thank you to our male champions who are part of this route towards making sure that it becomes conventional for women to be educated, to play these kind of roles in society, side by side with men, as well as with people with other gender identities. I'm not sure whether the Deputy Minister is already here.
Yes, I'm here. Okay. I managed to sign in with somebody else's account.
Oh, okay. Deputy Minister, I already introduced you with your very illustrious
obituary.
No, your very illustrious biography, both your role in the student movement, your various roles that you occupied in government, your educational achievements, and your commitment towards lifelong learning. So we look forward to your opening address and as part of setting the tone for this. So over to you, Deputy Minister.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's been quite a mission to try and set up. Yeah, and I'm going to try and keep this as brief as possible. And thank you very much for this invitation, for an opportunity for us to be able to engage with what I believe is a very crucial matter that has been engulfing our country for some time, and of course, now we'll have to put the discussion within context. But I think what's important is that we, look back into what we think is our mandate as the broadly as government, but also as the Department of Higher Education and Training, and want to try and locate this firstly within the context of our Constitution, which instructs us to provide basic education, including adult basic education, and also further education, with which the state, through reasonable measures, must make progressively available and accessible. So that's the constitutional provision. But also we take our mandate, politically from the Freedom Charter, which says that education shall be free, compulsory, and universal for all children, and that higher education and technical education shall be open to all by means of allowances and scholarships awarded on the basis of merit. And want to reaffirm, taking from the ANC conference resolution, the 54th conference resolution of the ANC, wherein we reaffirmed that education remains the apex priority of government's pro-poor policy, and that it is a central pillar of our fight against the triple challenges of poverty, inequality, and unemployment as outlined in the National Development Plan, Vision 2030, and that failure to accelerate inclusive access to higher education and training directly threatens the achievement of this key objective, and that the ANC must continue to strengthen measures that will improve access to higher education with the ultimate goal of achieving free higher education for the poor and missing middle, and that this should not be limited to the role that the NSFAS plays, but should also include the role of the private sector in this regard. And in line with the resolutions of the 52nd National Conference and the 53rd National Conference, the ANC government accelerates the implementation of a new financial support model to ensure that academically capable, poor, working class and middle strata students are supported to access higher education and receive fully subsidized free higher education and training by 2018, subject to availability of funds. And I think that that's an important emphasis, subjecting this to the availability of funds. And that steps should be taken to expand the TVET and community college sector and ensure that it is adequately funded. Now, our vision of and scope of the post-school education and training system is contained in our white paper on post-school education and training, and which says briefly that a post-school system that can assist in building a fair, equitable, non-racial, non-sexist and democratic South Africa, a single coordinated post-school education and training system, expanded access, improved quality, and increased diversity of provision, a strong and more cooperative relationship between education and training, institutions and the workplace, but also a post-school education and training system that is responsive to the needs of individual citizens and employers in both private and public sectors, as well as broader societal and developmental objectives. So our PSET system basically encompasses what we would refer to as education and training institutions on the one hand, other support organizations, also qualifications and quality assurance bodies, and this include UMalusi, the South African Qualifications Authority, a Council on Higher Education, the Quality Council for Trades and Occupations, and then the other leg of the 4 pillars of our PSET system becomes the skills level, which is our CETAS, our National Skills Authority, and also the National Skills Fund. I think, as you may be aware, the education and training institutions include universities, TVET colleges, but also private higher education and training institutions. So essentially, that's the PSET system as we have built it over the years. Now, what is the pipeline, from school to higher education or into universities or TVET colleges? If 100 students, and this is taken from a study that was made in 2016. So if 100 children start school, 60 of those would write their matric, 37 would complete with 14 bachelor passes, and 12 of those will be with diploma passes. 9 of those go immediately to university, and 3 would go later. And those who complete their undergraduate qualifications would be, only 6 would complete their undergraduate qualifications, and those who complete their degrees would only be 4. So you can see, the extent within which, many students fall by the wayside. And that if we are to, use this in percentage terms, mainly 4% of those who start their school ultimately would complete some form of qualification in our post-school education and training system. Now, NSFAS over time has been increasing in terms of funding. In 2014, 2015, NSFAS allocation was around 6 billion rand, or to be specific, 5.9 billion rand. And for the 2020-2021 academic year, 34.7 billion rand, which signifies government's commitment towards allocating resources in providing access and funding students through the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. And this has shot up. It doubled in 2017-18, and more than doubled from 2018 to 2020 to 34.7 billion rands. And in terms of the actual numbers, students in universities who've been funded by the National Student Financial Aid Scheme in 2018 are, in rand terms, in terms of the growth in expenditure, have now exceeded more than 20,000 rands. And in TVET colleges, of course, it had remained just above 5,000 rand. But in terms of the overall numbers of the number of students who are funded both by, in TVET and universities in 2019, that number has grown to close to 750,000. And we've seen a lot of interest of, students towards the post-school education and training system, which means that our commitment as government over time will have to increase in terms of the resources that we allocate towards student funding. And this is basically what has been the major challenge: the growing number of students, the growing cost in terms of higher education, regardless of the measures that the department and government has done to try and curb those costs, but also, thirdly and importantly, so a combination of those two, the growing cost of tuition, and also the growing number of students who want to enter our post-school education and training system. So what does this bursary scheme for university students mean? So it means fully subsidized tuition fees. So all students on DHET bursary scheme are fully subsidized. Learning materials are provided for those, fully subsidized accommodation, particularly for contact students, living allowances of 15,000 rands, incidental allowances for those who live in catering residences of about 2,900 rand, transport allowance for students living at home of about 7,500, so this is a comprehensive package that goes towards students. And when we break down the overall allocation to each of the students who are being funded by the NSFAS, it's about 59,000 per student. And the number of continuing students, that is those who are already in the system, is about 387,000, which constitute about 23 billion rand. And for new applications, the number for 2021 is at 186,755. So new students who are entering the system this year are about 186,000. Now, there was a shortfall, which was a part of the big discussions, which also resulted in some of the student protests. Our trends, 2020 trends have been used as a basis and capping projections to the enrollment plans. And in February 2021, NSFAS completed its application evaluation process, and the actual trends for universities and the following assumptions were made. Universities, firstly, are effectively restricted to enrolling full-time equivalents, that is new entrants to the 2020 proportion of NSFAS funded students to the F10 enrollment target, which is 10%, has been added. UNISA was restricted to enrolling 37,000 new students. Previously funded postgraduate qualifications are no longer funded for new entrants, which would include your LLB and some of the qualifications in education. Those have fallen by the way, and the old BTEC, those have fallen by the wayside in terms of funding. And a CPI increase is applied to tuition and accommodation allowances only, and a 0% increase for all other allowances. The 719 million TVET shortfall is predominantly due to the 10% buffer provided for accommodation allowances. And the university numbers include projected returning students, new students who are F10s or full-time equivalents, as well as continuing but previously not qualifying for the National Student Financial Aid Scheme. Now, what are the implications for the departmental budget? It means that 3.9 billion reduction from our voted funds, 2.49 billion from university funding. So we're basically taking money that was meant to go towards funding university grants, about 2.5 billion, 500 million from TVET infrastructure, 100 million from goods and services, and also to add on to that shortfall was about 3.3 billion rands from the National Skills Fund. And therefore the implications are that key programs which are aimed to support the economic recovery plan will therefore have to be stalled. So this is not new money that went into the department. It's basically money that has been there, that has therefore been reprioritized, and therefore resources have to be mobilized to ensure that we fund these students. Now, there's been this concept of the missing middle students, who are predominantly those who are affected and those who went out mainly to protest. Now, the missing middle refers to those students who do not meet the NSFAS financial eligibility criteria, but still struggle to afford higher education. A big chunk of these includes public servants, mainly your police, your nurses, your teachers, and also some who are within the private sector who fall within the bracket of 350,000 income per household, up to 600,000 income per household. And therefore, a greater in-depth analysis and data collection is necessary for us to understand the issues facing students who fall outside NSFAS eligibility and are self-paying. And it's also difficult to know how many students are not accessing public higher education at all because of financial difficulty. And therefore, the proportion of NSFAS students to self-paying students differ considerably across the different universities. In 2016, our minister appointed a task team to develop funding and support model for poor and middle-class students. And following this work, a pilot project was established to test possible models, which developed into the ICUSASA Student Financial Aid Program. A feasibility study was also conducted as part of that particular pilot. The original intent of the pilot was to address the feasibility of granting loans, bursaries with progressively reducing subsidies as household income increases for the missing middle students. And ISFAP, in their original model, assumed that government would cover full or part of the equity required to cover the debt, but this assumption was not supported by National Treasury. Now, ISFAP noted, based on the feasibility study and the engagement with the National Treasury, a loan-based system, which would be very difficult without government support. And in all the modeling done, the bad debt, capital repayment, and capital interest was always bigger than the repayments and interest paid by the students. And the same challenge is faced with the NSFAS before we made the transition towards a fully funded student bursary, wherein we have a huge debt of students who took up loans with the old TEFSA and now with NSFAS, but who are unable to pay or who just choose not to, not to pay. And we think that this is, the most crucial element of student funding, precisely because the key question is with the band that was announced in 2018 by former President Zuma of providing fee-free higher education for students whose household income, family household income, is up to 350,000. So which covers 90% of South African households. Now, whether this should be extended to include, those whose family income, household income is up to 600,000. So that's the big debate. And whether if we do that, where are we going to get the resources? But also the assumption being that, if a certain section of our population can afford to pay fee-free higher education, what does that mean? Does it mean that we should exempt them from paying even if they can? And I think that that's a crucial discussion. But also, where would the source of income and funding come from if we take that that particular route? So there are a whole range of initiatives, facilitator, which the department has come up with, whose intention is to address specifically the question of the missing middle, because we think that that's one of the crucial issues that we've had with the students, and broadly a challenge that is facing the post-school education and training system. And some of these initiatives include the 0% increase on university tuition fee. The funding cover this came primarily from the state. I think you remember in 2016 during the Fees Must Fall. In 2017-18, tuition fees increased by a maximum of 8% across the system in accordance with an agreed compact with universities. In 2019-21, tuition and accommodation fees were agreed in terms of a CPI-linked compact. Now, all of this are obviously temporary. We need a much more sustainable intervention to deal with the with the missing middle. And therefore, Cabinet has instructed our department to come up with a strategy in terms of how do we deal particularly with this issue, but broadly with a sustainable model towards student funding. Because even if the NSFAS model seemed to be working, we've proved this year, or it was shown this year, that with the increase in the interest and number of students who come out of the schooling system, we have to get more money to fund all of that. We've looked at the quantum of debt in the university system, and I must say that it's a huge debt, which means that universities cannot be able to run if they are not able to recoup this money. So most of the student protests this year were about students registering without the requirement and commitment to pay, that which they owe. And student funding still remains one of the major source of funding for universities. So I think that part of our engagements broadly has to include how do we deal with this. So what are the next steps? And in summary, we're working with universities to address the current debt issue that's preventing registration for some missing middle students. The minister yesterday met with the National Student Leadership. We've been interacting with them since the protest started. We're addressing the effective management and governance of NSFAS. There's a new board. The minister has put in place a committee of inquiry, which should be giving him a report later this year. We're addressing we're conducting a student funding policy review to examine the current situation. And this will include analyzing data relating to student funding and student debt, reviewing the Higher Commission report, the MTT report, and the IFSAP pilot model and feasibility study to reflect on work already done. We're developing policy options and funding source options. And also in the medium to long-term goal is to develop a comprehensive student funding model within a sustainable post-school education and training system. And this must be, I must emphasize, done in tandem with increased funding of non-student financial aid aspect of the system to develop human capital and infrastructure to enable the growth and rebalancing of the post-school education and training system. In the overall, if government has, and as we've said 1,000 times, that education, higher education in particular, remains the apex, it means that we have to direct resources towards this particular apex if we are to have a sustainable student funding model and policy, and also a sustainable post-school education and training system. And if we're going to continue to be the feeder into the skills need of our country and of our economy. Thank you very much, Comrade Phoebe.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I think that your input covers quite a large range of issues that's critical to the future of our country. The question about our commitment to free higher education for poor and working class students. What is the progress? What's the challenges? The question about the missing middle, the student debt issue, the administration of NSFAS, and all of the issues that you raise are all critical. I think that the one of the things that we often say is that we face a youth unemployment crisis in this country. But it seems to me just that 4% figure that you mentioned, that only 4% of the age cohort that each year starts school, at the end of the day, after whatever amount of years they spent in the education system, exit with a qualification. Now, for a country that talks about a skills revolution, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, etc. This is I think it's as much a crisis as the youth unemployment crisis, as well as the student funding crisis. And we therefore need to look at continual efforts, and I think that the Mannya-Maxeke Institute and its trustees, its staff play an important role to look at how do we curb dropout from schools, address the reasons why students drop out of school, but also looking at the completion rate in our post-school education and training sector, because at the end of the day, we need to look at the system holistically. If we committed to, and if we are, have to address our obligation that we, and the commitment we made in the Freedom Charter to open the doors of learning to all. So thank you very much, Deputy Minister. For those of our listeners that have joined us, the hashtag for the Charlotte Maxeke Institute is @CharlotteMaxeke. Our hashtag for today's event is hashtag the right to education. Kindly share your tag us in whatever you are posting about this issue of the right to education and the information that we're getting from our esteemed panelists. And thank you very much for being part of this. Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. Our next speaker is a very another illustrious person, Dr. Musa Wenkosi Suarombe, who has a PhD in industrial psychology. She, at the age of 23, became the youngest, not just in South Africa, but in the entire African continent, the youngest female PhD graduate, with her astounding academic record. She attained a PhD at the age of 23, when most people start their PhDs. She's also worked as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Northwest University, Mahikeng, from April 2017, appointed as senior lecturer at the University of Free State in 2019, and then recently joined the University of Free State also as a senior lecturer. She lectures in human resource management and also supervises postgraduate research, very accomplished academic. She's published, presented papers, both nationally as well as internationally, and a great civic innovator, specifically focusing on issues of young people as well as of women. Dr. Suarombe, the floor is yours, and we're very honored to welcome you to this platform. Kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Program Director, for that elaborate introduction and welcome. Kindly confirm whether my video.
Okay, we can see you clearly. We can see you well.
Okay, all right, wonderful. Without wasting much time, I'd like to extend a heartfelt greeting and reiterated welcome to the dignitaries represented here, Honorable Mannya-Maxeke, Ms. Nicole Morris, Dr. Yanela Njisani, distinguished CSRC presidents, the CMMI at large, all protocol observed. The subject of today's discourse is quite controversial and thought-provoking. When we ponder upon the role of education in our national and global societies, the urgency of the now long existing mandate of eradicating the malignancy of an uneducated society is further accentuated. Since this event is one of the commemorating events of Charlotte Maxeke's legacy, particularly during this year that has been declared by the ANC, the year of Charlotte Maxeke, it is important to address the matters we know as being closest to her heart, education being one of her most highlighted focal points of societal transformation. As Utada Madiba Nelson Mandela once famously said, and as implied by many other eminent scholars the world over, Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. Why is it then that education is one of the most protected commodities, almost like a rare animal species? I use the word commodity because the parameters that have been established around education over the years are absolutely preposterous. What would be one of the foundations of our society and thus typically, ideally, freely available has been pervaded by capitalism and monopoly, which has created the illusion that only those with the pecuniary or financial capacity have the right to a quality education. One of the most popular rhetoric we have heard is that if everyone has free access to education, then the current unemployment crisis, particularly faced in developing countries, would escalate. On the contrary, I believe one of the reasons why many developing, especially African countries, have not eluded the cycle of abject poverty and absurdly vast social and economic inequalities is due to the restricted access to free quality education. Allow me to use a ridiculous analogy to bring my viewpoint into perspective. Imagine if a brain were only given to an elite few. This would mean that those without one would lack the necessary capacity to make decisions and exercise other critical cognitive functions fundamentally required for survival. Now, I said ridiculous analogy because I want you to think of it this way, without taking any offense, because none is intended. While everyone has a brain, not everyone chooses to use it, or at least not as much as they should. Nevertheless, it is easier for us to hold anyone with an unimpeded functioning brain accountable to a certain standard of reasoning and conduct. I believe it is similar with education. If everyone had access to free quality education, despite it not being pragmatic for every citizen to be employed, we would, however, redistribute the accountability that is critically required in nation building, starting with an each one, teach one disposition. In addition, not everyone who has free access to something chooses to receive it. Those amongst us who are believers can better understand this through the concept of grace. Although it is available to all, not everyone chooses to accept it. But those who do need not offer any recompense for it. If only education could be treated like the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine, which has been made available to all, regardless of social, economic, and other status. Because an uneducated population is an insidious pandemic in itself, from which many social ills emanate. While the vaccine shall be free to all, no one will be obligated to take it, but at least everyone will be given an equitable fighting chance. I believe the same approach to free education would behoove this country. Many social burdens, such as the burden of hefty taxes in support of some of the unskilled, uneducated social grant recipient categories, could be alleviated through the accessibility of free quality education. And a culture of innovation and self-sufficiency would further be inculcated. Economic independence among all of the dignity of our people. I could go on and on, but due to time constraints, I would like to, in conclusion, echo the words of Charlotte when she prudently said, "This work is not for yourselves. Kill that spirit of self and do not live above your people, but live with them." And I paraphrase, and if you can rise, bring someone with you. Some of the hashtags that were used last year after the global pandemic broke out and lockdowns were imposed were save the semester and no one left behind. If we're truly to achieve the latter, it would behoove us to break apart the boundaries that currently preclude our society from being educated and, most importantly, being rendered accountable. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sarombe. I think that the issues that you raise are very critical, and I like your analogy that with the commercialization of education that we see increasingly across the world, it's increasingly become a rare animal that we need to look at how do we protect it, but also grow its numbers. You also pointed out the important link between free quality education and our developmental agenda, and the fact that access to education, and particularly quality and free education, give everybody an equitable fighting chance, and contribute towards innovation as well as self-sufficiency, and remind us of the goals that we talk about, and particularly in the sustainable development goals of leaving no one behind. Education is critical. Thank you so much for that contribution. For those who have just joined us, we are conducting the Charlotte-Maxeke dialogue, presidential dialogue with SRC presidents and other luminaries from across the country, focusing on the theme of the human rights to education. And remember, Twitter handle Charlotte-Maxeke and hashtag the right to education. We continue with the dialogue, and our next speakers are indeed the presidents of SRCs, University of Witwatersrand, Rhodes University, Cape Peninsula universities. They each have between 10 and 15 minutes to make their contribution on the theme of the right to education. And we will start off with, since we're in Joburg, or I'm in Johannesburg, just our neighbors, President of the SRC, Mr. Mpendula Mfeka, University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, former chairperson of SASCO. He served and was re-elected for 2 terms. A former Law Student Council chairperson, former ANC Youth League members of the branch executive committee, a trade law moot court world finalist, so he's got the gift of the gab, as they say, holds an LLB and a BA, as well as at the moment doing postgraduate studies in international economic law at Wits University. Mr. President, over to you.
Thank you. It's quite difficult to come after tried and tested people, you know. I'm coming after Dr. Musawekosi and the minister and Nicole, so the bar is set a bit higher. But I think first and foremost, I want to agree with the previous speaker, right? That being Dr. Musawekosi, to say, look, in a country where formal education is a prerequisite for socio-economic and occupational advance, the granting of such education to some and its denial to others not only crystallizes class imbalances, but reinforces racial inequalities, right? And I think in our country, this is a conversation that's older than our very constitutional democracy. It's older not only than our very constitutional democracy, but perhaps older than the Freedom Charter itself, right? We see it's penning down, or its documentation first in the Freedom Charter, right? Are colleagues with me?
We can hear you well.
I think I'm, okay, fine. I hope I'm.
We can hear you. Technical team, we seem to have a problem. Okay, it looks like we've lost the SRC president. We will come back to Mpendulo as soon as he's sorted out his connection. Mpendulo, are you there? Doesn't look like he's back on. Okay, so let's move on to another SRC president, Ms. Lebogang Nkambule, who is from Rhodes University, an honors student in political and international studies. She's serving her second term in the university SRC since 2020, where she served as community engagement counselor, and in this year as SRC president, a student activist and the first firm driver of social change and justice. Okay, I see we've got Mpendulo back. Continue, Chief. Just unmute yourself.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened for a moment there. But just to recap on where I was, I wanted to agree. I'll start from where I started. I want to agree with the previous speaker, Dr. Musa-Wenkosi, to say in our country, socio-economic, formal education is a prerequisite for socio-economic and occupational advance. And in a country where formal education is a prerequisite for socio-economic and occupational advance, it being granted to some and not to others not only reinforces class inequalities, but it crystallizes racial imbalances in our country, especially in a country which has been deemed and rendered by many institutions as the most unequal in society. But perhaps we're having the wrong conversation, right? And by wrong conversation, I mean the conversation of access to higher education in our country is older not only than our very constitutional democracy, but more than many conversations, right? And fortunately or unfortunately, we see it first being penned down in the Freedom Charter, right? And that means it goes as far back as your 1955s. So, but just to cite a different, to take the problem rather to its logical conclusion or to its logical genesis rather than the conclusion, I think we should look at the very structure of our education clause, that being section 29, right? It speaks largely to basic education and hardly ever addresses higher or post-basic education, right? It doesn't access or address the ability to access higher education beyond basic schooling. And I think that's the genesis of our problem. And the fact that, right, as perhaps a solution, which I will propose towards my conclusion, the fact that education or higher education, access to higher education, free education in our country is not legislated also contributes to the problem, right? So we can't be saying we want free education to be granted to some and not to others, but yet it's not legislated in our country. So the fact that it's not legislated also contributes to the problem, right? And more than anything, I must mention, yes, the steps that have been taken to try and address access to higher education in our country, which it's been mentioned that steps have been taken to try and address this. I don't think it's fair to say steps have been taken to address access to higher education. I think steps have been taken to address protest, right? So if we protest in 1 year for a no-fee increment, they'll come out and say, look, there won't be a fee increment this year. Then that will pacify or suppress the protest and people will go back to class. In the following year, you will protest for access through registration like we have this year. Then to pacify or to suppress the protest, people will come and be given access, or the registration will be waived. The registration fee will be waived. So I think what's been addressed in our country is not necessarily access to higher education, but protest in and of itself, student protest. So and in having the conversation, I think we are wrong in saying the right to education, right? Because there isn't a right to higher education in South Africa, not even in the Bill of Rights or in any law, right? It's not legislated. In fact, even the NEPSAS policy in and of itself is outdated, right? It's not in line with the 2017 pronouncement, right? To say students who come from the policy itself, not what is in practice. The policy itself is not in line to say students who come from household families of 350K or less per annum will be granted NEPSAS and they will benefit from the fruits of NEPSAS, right? It's not even there. It's not updated there. So I think the conversation needs to speak more, needs to begin speaking more to policy more than anything. And by saying it needs to speak more to policy more than anything, I mean, I think in the past 3 or 4 conferences, the ANC has resolved on implementing free education. The 54th conference did that. Not only did the 54th conference did that, in 1994, in fact, when the ANC went to elections, it promised people free higher education. So we need to start having the right conversation to say, look, why is it that every year we need to re-entertain and re-entertain? There's about 15 models of free higher education, right, that have been distributed among student circles, that have been submitted before Parliament, and so forth and so on. So, and it's unfair to say there's no funding for free higher education in my observation, because free education will fund itself. And on this point, I want to agree with Dr. Musawenkos. Free education will fund itself because it will reduce like future social spending on social grants and government-built houses, and thereby it will abolish. So if you abolish the paying of fees, it will reduce the social security spending on social grants, and 2 on government-built houses, and thereby increase economic growth, obviously. So. And it's been cited by many economists. I'm not an economist, by the way, but it's been cited by many economists to say, look, the education, or rather than us calling a skills-based country, calling ourselves a skills-based country, can only be achieved, right? A developmental state can only be achieved by the equipment or the right education of its people, right? And if we are going to defund higher education as it's been done, I think in the last budget pronouncement, or in the last budget speech, about 6 billion rands was taken away from higher education funding in our country. The deputy minister calls it reprioritization. I call it defunding. So if you take money and you take it from one department to another area, and you say you are reprioritizing that money, it means you're not prioritizing education in our country, right? And that money is being reallocated again because of student protest. And it goes back to my initial point of saying, what's been prioritized in our country, or what's been addressed in our country, is not necessarily free or free education, but protest in and of itself, student protest. So that's what's being addressed, right? So as it stands currently in 2021, the students across campuses, not only at WITS, but the students across campuses who are LLB or postgraduate students who were funded by NEFSAS in the previous year, but are not funded by the very same NEFSAS this year because of the defunding that we speak to today. And more than anything, I think there's been an unfairness from the Department of Higher Education as it relates, or as it regards this conversation of access to higher education, particularly as it regards fee increments on a yearly basis. So in one year, the fee increment will be 4.7 as it is this year. In the other, it will be 8%, and so forth and so on. But there won't be an explanation as to the projected extra costs for that financial year. So I don't think anyone in this country, or any university in this country that has increased fees, in fact, every university has increased fees, but I don't think any university in this country can give an adequate explanation. I've asked for this before the VETS Council and the VETS Senate and Senior Executive Team to say, what is the projected extra cost for the increase? So if you say 4.7%, please break it down. I think most student leaders across the country would cry foul, because observing what happened last year, there was supposed to be actually a fee reduction on fees, because no one used buses, no one used toilet paper, no one used water and electricity. Staff got retrenched, in fact, more than anything. So there was a reduced cost to the university. Much as there is this year, the academic year started much later than it ordinarily does. So I don't think we can keep on renovating NEFSAS, right? From one year to the next, we renovate, we patch here. The year after that, we patch there. The year after that, we patch there. We need to start having a deliberate conversation around a free education bill, which will encompass, obviously, historical debt, right? And this needs to be held at a national level more than in Parliament alone. Because once it's held in Parliament alone, students being left out of the conversation will be a blunder that we make, right? Because I did point out to say our very Bill of Rights doesn't speak to higher education funding. And it's a problem. Comrades made a mistake in 1993 when they adopted the interim constitution. right? And it was a mistake which, in our observation, is a mistake which we can still reconcile or still fix at this point in time. They could only do so much at the time, but the conversation needs to be taken to a more higher level. I mean, the fact that a Black university student is having this conversation in 2021, whereas a Black university student could not in 1993, is a step forward, right? But that conversation needs to go further than it has. And for it to go further than it has, we will start with a free education bill being tabled in Parliament. We can't, on a yearly basis, be renovating NEPSAS, and the very renovation of NEPSAS is not even in policy, right? In the amending of policy or anything. The same policy of NEPSAS at implementation or at adoption is the same policy today. The resolutions that have been taken to address the shortfalls of NEPSAS over the years are not even legislated in the very policy of NEPSAS. So, in conclusion, I want to agree with the previous speaker to say, look, for us to address the economic imbalances in our country and the racial imbalances more than anything, it's for us to implement free, quality, and decolonized education. It won't take away, as it's been misled or it's been the misguided conversation in society today, to say, no, where will funding come from? Where will we get money to fund free, quality education? I mean, we've said this, free education in our country will fund itself. Social grants and government-built houses, among other services that government provides, will be the funds that are redirected to ensure that our people have access to free higher education, because the more people who have as educated, the better we become as a developmental state. Thank you. I hope I didn't speak for too long.
That's fine. You've got 30 seconds still left on your time. Thank you very much.
No, I'll give it over to the next speaker.
Okay. Thank you very much, Comrade President. I think that the issues that you raise about, and I think the central point that the lack of access and a policy on this matter reinforce the inequality, so that when we talk about the triple challenges and the persistence of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, but inequality, which you stress, indeed, education plays a critical role. I think that Deputy Minister raised it, but you come from it from a different angle, the importance of having a comprehensive policy. And next month, on the 27th of April, we will be celebrating 27 years since the dawn of our democracy. And there is therefore a need to look at all of these questions in terms of where do we want to go to in the next 27 years. And that conversation and what we do needs to start today. The questions proposal that you made around the free education bill, looking at what we're saying in our Bill of Rights about it, the funding model, but also the question about that the perspective that free education will pay for itself, that if you have an educated population, and I think our previous speaker also made the point from a different angle, that if you have a more educated and more generalized educated population, it contributes towards a citizenry that's innovative and that's also more self-sufficient. So I think that it's an important point that the points that you raise. The question about, as you speak about that, the progress that we made on free education it came through the protests of students. And I think it's an important point that no process of social change happen in the absence of activism. The women's movement, the gains that we made in terms of gender equality and the gains that we still need to make against the scourge of gender violence won't come unless there are activism. And I think that the roles that you play in the student representative councils as SRCs is an important pointer to society about these critical issues that we need to resolve as a nation. And I think that as a generation, it's important that you do raise these issues. We're now going to the next president in our presidential Charlotte-Maxeke dialogue. Ms. Lebogang Nkambule is the president of the SRC of Rhodes University, honor student in political and international relations. She is serving since 2021. She served a term on the SRC before, and she's now serving as president. a student activist and a firm driver of social change and social justice. She has started many of her own organizations. We talked about self-sufficiency, one of them being the Diamonds in the Rough that mentors young girls from a local high school. Her work in community development had earned her many accolades, such as the Investec Top 100, and she was also selected to be part of the Youth South Africa Institute of International Affairs for the SA-USA Community Exchange Program. Comrade President Magosi Nkambula Lebogang, the floor is yours. We look forward to your contribution. Kindly unmute and take the floor.
Thank you very much, Comrade Phoebe Potgieter. Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
All right, thank you so much. Let me first start by greeting everyone that is joining us on this platform. Also greetings to the esteemed guests in this platform and also all protocol observed. I'm the Rhodes University SRC President. I'm very much honored to be a part of this very important and profound conversation. I think I've very much been fully captured by the previous speakers in terms of our conversation on free education and what that really encapsulates and what that really means also in the context that we have found ourselves in as young student leaders in 2021. I think the conversation of free education is an immense epitome of the systematic and structural inequalities that very much still exist in our country in 2021. This also having to look back in our history in the 1976 protests and having to once again fight against systems of oppression. And that is where we are also now having to find ourselves in the year of 2021. I think in 2015, during the protest and during the times of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, it very much we saw a symbolic fall of inevitable fall rather of white supremacy and privilege. And this signaled another moment in history, where once again in 2016 you had an unaffordable rise of fees, and these also have to be inclusive of Rhodes University fee increments in 2016, where the 50% initial fee payment was expected from students. So students had to very much once again fight against this unimaginable structural and oppressive systems that have very much once again excluded the poor and working class and middle class students. This having to exist at a point where we have found ourselves once again being very tired of the politics of patience and hope that still continue to exclude, to ostracize, and we are finding ourselves in a position where we are once again our poverty and us having to deserve an education in this country. And I also think when it comes to the conversation of the impact of the Fees Must Fall movement, its initial impact was to ensure that the protest within was to prevent a raise rather of university tuition during that time. However, the protest then resulted in the national guarantee by the national government on free higher education for students, then leading into the 2018 national bursar scheme for poor and working class students, totaling to 12.4 billion. This brought about, furthermore, the success of the decolonial imperative and also the educational spaces to be decolonial that have existed before, to disenfranchise, also then to alienate the Black student and staff within the spaces of higher learning. So when we are bringing ourselves into the conversation once again of free education, it has been a continuous conversation that continues every year. And for me, we have once again reached a point where we have to engage in dialogues where we are providing means of solutions, but now these solutions are not being implemented. So we're really having to find ourselves, having to deliberate once again on will we engage in a different dialogue in the next coming year, where we are having to once again rid ourselves in terms of fighting against systematic and structural oppression. So when we are now moving into the spaces of free education, I think the constitutional provisions should ensure that there's access to quality free education is made available. Most importantly, in the context of South Africa, being that the ultimate goal of the country has to speak to the transformed, the equitable, and the shared economic development and growth of the country, for job creation, for building of an equitable society that would ensure a better life for all. When we are seeing and also having to articulate in Rhodes University, the institutional uniqueness that we found ourselves in, where postgraduate students such as your LLB and your PGCE, these existing as scarce skills that have to be funded rather, are now having to find themselves not being funded by the state simply because of funding shortfall, is very much it existing as a different form of oppression and a disservice to students once again, where there is a reallocation of funds. Rather, I concur with the sentiments that were shared by the previous speaker, the SRC president, to say that this is once again having to ensure that we are just halting protests and not rather providing tangible and sustainable solutions regarding students being defunded. Because where is a student expected and now having to be in a postgraduate space to fund themselves and to provide an allowance for themselves in now moving into the narrative of 2021? Furthermore, on the sentiments that were shared by the Deputy Minister of saying the conversation around an academically deserving student having to access the spaces of learning. When we speak of an academically deserving student in the context of COVID-19, where students were subjected to their homes being their places of living and conducive learning, we are very much aware that in our spaces and the changing profile of our students, that we will have more students that will be NSFAS funded, having to access the spaces of higher learning. In terms of that, the conducive spaces that students would be in to ensure the academic success. Now we are seeing a rise of students in 2020, whether these were first-time entering students or rather the general student populace, having to now, we re-envision the academically deserving student in the time of COVID-19, where the student now had to study from the home, and that now having to very much create another means of conundrum of saying that we need to look at the context and the crises that was brought about also in the context of COVID-19 and its impact on the general student populace, most importantly on the populace regarding the academia and the academically deserving, and also having to speak to academic performance by students in the year of 2020. And I very much believe that 2021 is not going to be in any way different, as we'll still be finding ourselves in a narrative of virtual online learning. I think that in having to my concluding remarks, that I agree that there has to be a comprehensive student funding model that is established, not only just existing, it has to come from a national trajectory that has to set that specific policy that would ensure that we are not finding ourselves in spaces where we are now having to dialogue and gather once again on the conversation of free education, whereas a freedom charter does promulgate that all the doors of learning should be open to all its citizens that are living in it. So I think I will conclude there and also say that we need to think in terms of the policy, a comprehensive model, and also then looking at expenditure cuts and having to establish a policy that would be sustainable in the future, and not just having to adopt models that would speak to the time being, but would rather be sustainable to all its citizens that exist in this country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Ledogang, for that very emphatic input around the contextualizing the issues raised by the Fees Must Fall movement. but also I think repeating what the other speakers have said, that that to exclude students that want to have access and has a yearning for education means that it's a form of structural violence. That the important issue about that the constitutional provision for quality free education that was raised by the previous speaker, and also for drawing attention to the specifics that students face now as they deal with this provision, what you call the academically deserving students, whereas every single sector of society has to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic last year. What does it mean for the ability to have a normal learning environment for students, and how we then take it into consideration, as well as the possibility that 2021 will continue to face those kind of challenges. Your focus on the need for a comprehensive policy, but also a comprehensive student funding model that address all of those issues. So thank you very much for that exposition. I think that it certainly contributes to our understanding of the matter. We're going to have our final president, SRC president, Comrade Nganga Kodana. I hope I pronounce it correctly. From the Cape Peninsula University, who, let me just see, who is doing a diploma of operations management, who is been a member of SASCO. He also indicated that he's from a family of 6 siblings, and originally from Engobo in the Eastern Cape. Comrade President Nanga, you have the floor, and we're looking forward to your input and contribution. Thank you very much, and kindly unmute yourself.
Thank you, Chairperson of the session. Firstly, before I speak further, I request that the House accept my apology for losing connection. I tried to log in and then I lost it in the middle of the session. I want to apologize for that. Going forward to my input, firstly, I want to thank the leadership that has invited me to this important session. Firstly, a session that speaks to women empowerment, a session that speaks to free education, which is a struggle that we are currently embarking on. It's a call that has existed a long time ago. We've been promised this free education. However, we up to date, we are still faced with the struggle that has not bear fruits as yet. We are dealing with a government that continues to fail us in this regard. We have other countries that have implemented free education, but our country hasn't. Our proposals, we have tabled them before, and our demands were clear that free education is a right. It should not be a privilege for those that are affording. They can study, but those that are poor and those that fall from the middle class should then not have that opportunity. It is then upon those deliberations that free education is a call that will assist all, so that a financial burden should not then be a constraint to the South Africans, particularly in the higher education sector. Up to date, colleague, we are still faced, there is unrest across the country. We are still facing financial exclusions. Up to date, we are still fighting for registrations. because our government hasn't adhered and listened to. Recently, I was in a meeting with the portfolio committee where Minister Blade Nzimande was present. He then was given an opportunity to utter some words. He confirmed that we do have free education, which came as a shock to us all. That the free education he's speaking about was NSFAS. NSFAS has brought nothing to the student community but a problem, because up to date, even if you have NSFAS, you will still be financially excluded. Minister has alluded that institutions are busy doing something about trying to accommodate the missing middle, the middle class, of which in some institutions we don't see such strides. There is nothing that is happening. Universities are protesting all over, and some are not. This tells us that there are some mechanisms that can be put in place to address this, and the only clear mechanism that can assist us all is free education. Sadly and disappointing as it was to hear the minister uttering such, saying that we have free education. As I've alluded that NSFAS is a problem, is not solving our issues. You still get excluded and you must still go and sign acknowledgement of debt forms in these universities, of which it still remains a problem. It does not solve the issue and it does not speak to our struggle. Our struggle is strictly based on free education. One of the proposed solutions that we want to put on the table to our government, if we have countries like the European countries, Germany, we have Sweden, countries that have implemented free education, why can't our government take the call, go and benchmark if it needs to, so that they can come and meet our needs? Because really it is that we, in these institutions of higher learning, we are struggling. These debates have been ongoing, but we have never seen implementation. And we are suffering on the ground. So these are the matters that are affecting us in the higher education sector. And this has been ongoing ever since 2015, when we came with the call of fees must fall. And there was unrest across the country. And we still, instead of us being listened to by our government, but we're just subjected to systematic victimization, which is one of the tools that is being used in this institution to silence our call as leaders. So we are facing such, and we wish that our government can come in terms with us and have these deliberations to pave the way forward, not to take the little we have. Because recently, Minister Nzimande confirmed to us that there was money that was reattracted, that a money that was meant to go to our education sector. Disappointingly as that is, that means that our call for free education is still very far, and we still have a lot to do. So, Chair, I don't want to be so much long. I want to thank you, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much to our SRC President, Nanga, who I think in a very firm way raised some of the issues that our other speakers have also raised. The commitment of free education for all and the ongoing problems of financial exclusions, the problems of registrations, the issues around the missing middle, as well as the fact is that you know, that as a country, 27 years into democracy, we we have made progress, but there are still quite a lot of areas that we still need to address. And I think that the demands of students that he spoke about are amongst the key issues that we face. He also raised the correct question and the problem with the NSFAS. I think that the Deputy Minister himself has acknowledged the problems that there are, the efforts that they made to address that. But that when we talk about a comprehensive student funding model, this should include part of the things that we need to look at a nation. So thank you very much, President Nanga, for your contribution and the very critical issues that you have raised. We're now going to our last speaker, which is Ms. Busi Siabe, who is an author, gender and social justice activist and entrepreneur, a National Fees Must Fall student leader, runner-up of the SABC One Day Leader reality show. She calls herself a Black radical feminist and currently completing a master's degree at Wits University in critical diversity studies. She has worked for the Department of Basic Education, the UN International Children's Fund, as well as the Department of Arts and Culture on the issues of girls and boys education, has been ambassador for the Always Keep Girls in School campaign, and I think that we can learn lessons from her. Ambassador for the Wildlife Foundation, Generation East West Rand coordinator, the South African Youth Parliament, the list goes on. Busi is, of course, also a former Our Social Economic Research Institute research fellow. She's recently worked for the Thabo Mbeki Foundation Youth Hub and think tank, and has published various articles and journals throughout the country, has been named Cosmopolitan Magazine Change Agent, and the list goes on. We obviously are in very accomplished panelists today, and we look forward to listening to Ms. Siabe's input and contribution towards this critical theme of the Mannya-Maxeke presidential dialogues. Today's one is on the human right to education. And we now hand over to Ms. Siabe to give her input. Kindly unmute yourself, ma'am.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and the discussion so far. But noting that I am a Black radical feminist, I'd like to just take the conversation to just like higher depths, right? But more than anything, I think I must mention that in a segregated South Africa, Mom Charlotte Maxeke dedicated her life to the struggle for women's rights and education for all. And in noting and keeping with that kind of energy and theme, especially around my own Black radical feminism, I believe that the funding of free education, and particularly free decolonized education, is something that is very imperative for the development of this country and for also the progression of moving out of inequality and forming a more equitable kind of society, right? So I definitely agree with the WITS SRC president when he speaks about the fact that free education can fund itself. But I think it's also very important for us to take a step back and to also acknowledge the fact that the South African education system is characterized with poor performance of school children, right? So the education system is also characterized with inequalities and discriminates children from poor families and communities. So in post-1994, government has failed to repurpose education from the dual apartheid education system that prioritizes minority whites while subjecting majority of Black children into an inclusive education system for all. Instead, South Africa has continued with dual education that discriminates against the poor. And this dual kind of education system is what we're finding problems with when we reach institutions of higher learning. And by institutions of higher learning, I don't just mean universities, predominantly white historical universities at WITS and UCT, but I'm also speaking about community colleges. I'm also speaking about TVETs as well, which is a very important conversation that I feel as though as a panel collectively we have failed to bridge the gap between the struggles that we see in TVET colleges, in community colleges, and in universities, because there is a quality and inequality kind and class basis for those divisions amongst those students, right? So when we look at, starting in October 2015, South African public universities experienced a wave of student protests, initially of a proposed fee increases for the 2016 academic year, right? So the protest started at the University of the Witwatersrand, and they soon spread to all government-funded universities. However, students' disgruntlement with a number of issues in South African higher education had been boiling under the surface for a long time. For an example, in the earlier year, the country had witnessed the Rhodes Must Fall protest, which was triggered by students' unhappiness over the continued presence of the statue of Cecile Rhodes and other symbolisms of colonialism at the University of Cape Town. By January 2016, the Fees Must Fall protest had broadened in scope to unhappiness with student accommodation and language of instruction, as cleaners, gardeners, and security guards needed to be insourced into institutions of higher learning. So you see the Fees Must Fall movement essentially encompassing and bringing together other struggles within the education system, within the education sector of the country, that are very vital to not only development as a developing nation, but also to transformation and decolonization, right? And this is very important. And the reason why universities and TVET colleges and community colleges as well become important sites for transformation and decolonization is because of the fact that they are microcosms of society. So to a large extent, whatever you find happening in institutions of higher learning, be it universities, TVETs, or community colleges, you will see sentiments of that echoed and being manifested within our society. So when you look at issues such as gender-based violence, there's serious gender-based violence issues in institutions of higher learning, in the schooling system itself, not only in higher education, but also in basic education. Because, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, about 43% of violent crimes that happen amongst young people and youth happen in institutions, be it in secondary school or in universities. But those kinds of institutions are facilitators of inequality, class divisions, and other socioeconomic barriers, right, and entries to society. So Fees Must Fall becomes the means in which we try to address a lot of these societal ills, to address a lot of the shortcomings and the lack, and I will say this very unapologetically, the lack of political will from the ANC-led government. And this is a lack of political will that has been there for the past 26 years, and we're about to go on 27 years. And I believe for the next 10 years, we'll continue to have no political will on the side of the ANC-led government, even though free decolonized education is a constitutional freedom charter mandate and a policy of the ANC. It is one that they are not willing to fulfill, because we also need to take into consideration the corruption that is happening within the institutions of higher learning and within the state, right? So before I continue, I just want to briefly to speak about what I mean specifically when I speak about corruption. So for an example, NSFAS has incurred 5 billion rand in irregular expenditure for the 2019-2020 period, right? So while in 2018-2019, it was about 3.2 billion, Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Education, on Higher Education, Science and Technology has described the National Students Financial Aid Scheme audit outcomes under administration as the worst ever. Right? These shortfalls and inability to account for most of the funds that have led to great frustration in institutions of higher learning, as the challenges of the past have continued to persist, is one of the reasons why, as a Fees Must Fall movement, we want the complete removal of the NSFAS system, because it facilitates corruption, it facilitates wasteful expenditure and irregular expenditure that the ANC-led government cannot account for, that they are unwilling to account for. In them accounting or attempting to account, we will see commissions coming up that will cost us 100 more millions of rands of money that can be redirected and invested in free decolonized education. So NSFAS has not improved with the continuance in late payments to universities and a veil of fraud and corruption that consistently hovers over this critical institution. Right? So NSFAS has been a problem for the Department of Higher Education and Training, And it is evident that there is a need to reform the way that it is modeled. But this is not something that, there's political will around. This is not something that we are seeing, active engagement in trying to readdress, right? So when we speak about, free decolonized education, we also need to take into cognizance the fact that it is a human basic right. And I would say that decolonization at its premises, at its foundation in decolonizing education becomes very critical and very important because it allows us to rechange, reform, and restructure the epistemological and also the curriculum in which we are taught, not only in higher education, but in basic education. So the Fees Must Fall movement does not only just come and say that we want free higher education, because let's also be very realistic about something. Not everyone who leaves secondary school enters university, TVET, or community colleges, right? So there's a very small percentage of young people that go into institutions of higher learning to get advanced, degrees or qualifications or certificates, right? So in understanding that, then you begin to understand the fact that the reason why there was such a slow or a very low input of young people in institutions of higher learning is because our basic education system is fundamentally flawed and very problematic. And the reason why I say this is because to date, right, the Department of Basic Education cannot tell you how many students have dropped out from grade 1 up until matric in the class of the year 2020. So those are numbers and statistics that they aren't able to give us, because you'll find that over 250,000 young people from grades 1 to matric drop out of school on a yearly basis, which means that we are losing a lot of young people and relegating them to the outskirts of society and to the periphery of society, where they are subject to violence such as drugs, where they're subject to violence such as, GBV and other societal ills that could be addressed using a very structured and well decolonized education system or curriculum that isn't available in our schools, right? So it is important to frame the Fees Must Fall movement protest according to a cultural basis, which lies in that it inspired a number of other demands by students, albeit not of equal measure. Examples include the outsourcing must fall, end rape culture, and patriarchy must fall, and such demands and others, of all which aggregated into Fees Must Fall, despite being rooted in philosophies such as Black consciousness and decolonization, also represent a cultural shift which is driven by the search for a post-colonial South African university in which, amongst other things, students seek solidarity with fellow students and workers as well. So Mpofu Welsh, right, speaks about and he alludes to the rationale of looking at the character of the protests through a cultural prism in light of the spread of fallism and its program of action in other parts of the world, such as Europe and America. Right? So the Fees Must Fall movement is important because it addresses critical issues relating to inequality, poverty, and development in South Africa. There is immense frustration amongst young people who are barred from entering institutions, even though they would be academically eligible and qualify for financial support, in addition to employers being unable to find the skills they need to stay competitive. Right? So the movement sought to ensure that there were long-term needs met to fundamentally improve the basic education system, investing in human capital by enrolling more students in universities, TVET, and community colleges, as well as improving quality of educators as a major imperative. So public discussion about higher education funding in South Africa has been beset by numerous fictions and misunderstandings since the Fees Must Fall movement emerged in 2015. These have been compounded by the political opportunism of former President Jacob Zuma and his advisors. Right? And the reason why I say this is because in many respects, former President Jacob Zuma's free education proposal is the worst kind of populism. It's been sold as a radically progressive policy that can be achieved with no negative consequences. But it will actually do very little for the neediest of South Africans. And it could have negative consequences for the stability and the progressiveness of public expenditure, which is something we need to take into cognizance. right? And this is because in mid-December 2017, with relatively little consultation or planning, former President Zuma announced that in 2018, free education would be provided to all new first-year students from families that earn less than 350,000 per year. My face, should just respond to how ridiculous, how absolutely ridiculous that was. I personally myself could not believe it. And the reason why I say this is because government needs to find a way of ensuring that proposals such as, doubling the skills levy on companies or increasing income taxes are not empty, and that they address the negative consequences of tax increases. So free education can fund itself, as Umbedu had mentioned, primarily by reducing future social security spending where it is needed and has went to corruption and wasteful expenditure. There's a positive relationship between higher education and economic growth. This can be done when institutions of higher learning produce dramatically more graduates and so increase their economic contribution. But more than anything, I think just as I wrap up, because when it comes to free education, I can talk a lot, so I can say a lot of things, right? But just to wrap up, I think one thing that we must definitely take into cognizance is that the recent fallism movements and protests reflect the way that students and academics use their agency to think, reflect, and act on societal matters that concern all citizens. To perform one's agency is important, not only to cultivate a healthy democratic environment where citizens can articulate their free will, but also to challenge the hegemonic structures that limit the agency of people. One common way in which the protesters have challenged the structure of higher education during the various fallism movements is by asserting that nothing in higher education has changed after apartheid. This claim is neither completely true nor altogether false. And this is why narratives such as patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism continue to dominate the structure of higher education. It is these narratives that are being challenged during the protests, when the naturalization of male dominance is challenged, when the neurocentric nature of the curriculum is questioned, and when demands are made for free higher education. So we need to start looking at why campaigns such as the hashtag Sizofunda Ngenkani campaign continuously arises every single year under the banner of Fees Must Fall. It's not that there is no funding, it's just that the ANC-led government has a problem with corruption, fraud, irregular and wasteful expenditure. There is no political will, and they don't have a clear vision or policy position on where they would like free decolonized education to steer the development of our country. And that should worry all South Africans, not just people trying to access higher education and training. I will leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Busi. My attention was just being drawn that you're also amongst the presidents. You were the WITS SRC president during your period. I don't know exactly which period. During the early discussion before we start, Pendula is showing us all the different, a board with all of the different presidents. So I'm sure your name is also found there. But thank you very much for that exposition, and also for drawing attention to some of the issues that weren't necessarily highlighted by our other speakers. The question about the need to link university struggles with the struggles in TVETs and community colleges. The link between education struggles and other struggles, and particularly the issue of the struggle against patriarchy, the struggle against GBV, not just in higher education institutions, but also in basic education. And I think that your point raised about the fact that, as you said, 43% of young people who experience violence does so in an education institution, the question about political will that you raised, as well as corruption and irregular expenditure, all critical issues in this debate that we need to take in consideration. And then echoing the questions raised by other speakers about the need for a comprehensive student funding model, as well as the what do we mean by free decolonized education. And thank you very much for that exposition. We are rounding up this very critical dialogue. It's now say that I'm supposed to be the dialogue respondent, but what I want to do is to, in a sense, summarize some of the major issues raised here at a very critical dialogue, as well as some of the issues that we need to take forward as a society. The first one is that all of the speakers spoke, from the Deputy Minister to our different presidents. Nicole spoke about the important role as key pillar to our developmental state, to our development as a country. And therefore, we have to keep on asking the question, what's happening in education, whether it is the question about what's happening in schools, what is happening in our universities, what's happening in our TVET, what's happening with literacy, what's happening with lifelong learning for workers. If we want to address and remain serious about tackling the questions about poverty, unemployment, and inequality, and get rid of the legacies of apartheid colonialism as well as patriarchy. The Deputy Minister raised the broad mandate of what we're talking about and what we focused on today, the post-school education and training system and what it consists of, and some of the advances that we've made, as well as the challenges that we face. I think that all of the speakers raised the very important issue about, we're talking about free education, we're talking about education that contribute to national development, but we're also talking about decolonized education, and what do we mean by that? There is an African Union resolution that was taken about, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the AU in 2013, where it says that across the continent, we need to teach Pan-Africanism as part of our curriculum in schools, as well as universities. And that's not just having it as a standalone subject, but looking at how, when we talk about history, when we talk about geography, when we talk about mathematics, when we talk about economics, how do we take it from a Pan-African perspective and from a developmental and egalitarian and a social justice perspective. So the discussion and the critical demand of the fees must fall generation for decolonized education, for free education, for quality education is something that our society needs to continue grappling with. Amongst the critical issues that was raised and that came to the fore, and I think our last speaker raised it in relation to drop out from school, the question about that we can't have real-time information about how many students drop out from grade 1 to grade, I would imagine grade 12, but also drop out from universities. And I can see where she's coming from, because real-time information enable you to intervene at the root cause of the problem. If you look at statistics retrospectively and say that 5 years ago, this age cohort, so many people dropped out of school. In fact, they already left the system. They've already had 4 or 5 years of being excluded from the education system. And in a sense, getting them back into the system will be much more difficult. So I think that she raised a critical issue about the need for real-time statistics about what's happening in our education system. And I think the same goes for our universities, as well as our TVET colleges as well, that we need to know what's happening. The point that Nicole raised at the beginning, who are our students? And I suppose asking the questions, where are our students at any point in time? The questions about whether the funding model for higher education, clearly there are problems. I think that the issues that all of you raise with the NSFAS, the issues around financial exclusions, the questions about fees increase every year, and the fact that we tend to sort of like seem to be making policy on the hoof, and based on which voices raise these issues, and the extent to which these issues are being raised by the student movement. But we don't really have a clear vision about if we're saying that we want to have a skills revolution that must drive our national development in the country, as well as part of the Southern African region and the African continent, then we need to have a long-term vision and then be able to say, what do we need to do today? And how does what we do in terms of our funding, in terms of our taxation system, in terms of access issues, how does it fit into this overall model of a developmental society that we need to build? And I think, I would imagine that's where the agency, but also the political will that our last speaker raised come into. To the trustees of the Charlotte-Maxeke Institute, I think that the issues that's been raised here today are very critical. The student movement and student leaders have raised the fact that they have made contributions and made policy suggestions across the board on all of these different critical issues that they have raised. And I think that one of the things that we need to say, and that is an attribute of Mam Charlotte-Maxeke, is to be able to say that we have heard you, we have listened, and we need to be able to together look at how do we take forward these issues, and take forward the critical issues that's been raised in today's dialogue. Let me once again repeat the quote that we read earlier, that I wish from Mam Charlotte-Maxeke, that I wish there were more of our people here to enjoy the privileges, and I'm substituting higher education and university education and post-school education, and then go back to teach our people, so that our home can lose that awful name, the Dark Continent. But I think also the attributes that we give to our communities of poor communities, underprivileged communities, and be properly called the continent of light, properly called that indeed we have reached those aspirations that we set out in the Freedom Charter, in the African claims of a society that belongs, a South Africa that truly belongs all of us, where you don't have the duality that our speakers spoke about today, where the aspirations of our young people are being addressed, and where we, in 10 years' time, as one of the speakers said, don't have to look back and then say, but we have another lost generation and yet another lost generation because we haven't taken the necessary decision that we need to take today. I've come to the end of my facilitation of this session, and will now hand over to Dr. Yonela Njisane, who is the esteemed chairperson of the Charlotte Mannya-Maxeke Institute, to do the vote of thanks on behalf of the board and on behalf of this august institution. Thank you very much to our esteemed panelists. I think that you have raised in a very robust and systematic way very critical issues, both drawn from your own experience, but also looking at the situation that our country finds itself in, as well as being part of an African continent and a global community of humanity. Thank you very much for those issues that you've raised in such a forthright manner. I've certainly learned a lot from your engagements today, and thank you for being part of this presidential dialogue today, and taking the time to join us. I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Yonela Njisane, the chairperson of the Institute, to do the vote of thanks, and that will round up the March edition of the Charlotte-Maxeke Presidential Dialogues, and we thank the presidents. Over to you, Dr. Njisane.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to clarify, I am not the chairperson yet. I will take it as a prophecy, as a prophecy that one day
My apologies.
I might just be. I'm a self-employed academic research consultant, and I am an ambassador for the CMMI. organization. On behalf of the CMMI, we'd like to express a word of gratitude and appreciation to each and every one of you that have joined us this afternoon as we unpacked this important topic, particularly the participants, which include our excellent program director for a very well done job, Honorable Minister Buti Mannya-Maxeke, Ms. Nicole Morris, Dr. Sarombe, and our panelists who are also various SRC presidents. We'd like to also acknowledge or recognize the technical team, the CMMI team, and everyone that has joined us from various platforms. This is definitely one of the ways that we could ensure that we meet up in some way. Mannya-Maxeke's expectations that she alluded to in one of her famous quotes that I'll just, one part of it talks about how if we rise, we bring someone with us. So as we have risen, everybody in this platform, everybody has achieved so much, everybody has been so lucky to have access to this education that we speak of and are still fighting for others. It is necessary, it is such, it is in such necessary and crucial platforms where we'll keep getting closer to eventually finding and implementing sustainable solutions that will stand the test of time to ensure that we do not live above our people, but we live with them. So that's it for me. I would just like to say that you keep safe and keep well out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador of the CMMI, and not chairperson, but that's prophetic. We are moving towards Easter weekend. It's a time of family, it's a time of worship, and we wish everybody a blessed Easter weekend. Kindly ensure that we arrive alive. If you travel, please make sure to wear your mask, keep the social distance, and make sure that we avert a possible third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic by taking care of each other, taking care of ourselves, taking care of our loved ones. And thank you very much. And do remember the Twitter handle of Charlotte Maxeke at Charlotte Maxeke, as well as the right hashtag, the right to education. This brings us to the end of our program, and thank you very much.